and come up with your own examples of in-group favoritism. And I think you'll all realize that to a large extent, you engage in in-group favoritism. There's nothing wrong with that, but you have to realize that in-group favoritism can cloud your judgment and lead to bias and discrimination. So this is a very important concept. I was fortunate to, psychology was one of my triple majors in college, in addition to 2 other social sciences. But priming and stereotyping is just fascinating. And I think you'll find this is really interesting. So everybody engages in stereotypes. When you see this picture, nobody would assume that he's being nominated by President Biden as the next United States District Court judge in the Middle District of California, or the Northern District of California, or the Southern District of California. So sometimes stereotypes are very accurate, and we all stereotype, just like I did with Devin earlier today. Now, this is an interesting stereotype. I had several large criminal conspiracy cases with motorcycle gangs during my tenure as a federal district court judge, but not with this particular individual. But the interesting thing is, he's an opera singer. That's his job. Not many people would think that because of stereotypes. Here's a good one. I've asked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people, who are these 12 women? The most common answer I received was the Olympic hockey champions. Well, that's not a bad guess. These 12 women all have post-PhD degrees in the very hard sciences, like astrophysics, neuropsychology. It's not the first thing that people think of because they're primarily women of color. So here's a great one about priming. Let me get it. Yeah. So this was a study where they actually gave people implicit association tests, and they were looking for people with strong anti-Black implicit biases, like myself, 2 standard deviations above the mean in terms of statistical analysis. So once they got this group with strong anti-Black implicit bias, they showed them a picture of President Obama that was Photoshopped, either with lighter skin on the left or darker skin on the right. And when they were shown the lighter skin, there was an 18% increase in their willingness to vote for President Obama. So you're being primed by the lighter or the darker skin. Here's another study. Notice the Marizan Banaji is the middle author. This was a really interesting study where they went out and bought a bunch of baseball cards, all rated the same. Baseball cards have ratings like stamps and coins. And they had like 6 Wade Boggs baseball cards. They did this with a dozen or more professional baseball players. And they put in for sale on eBay. Kind of an expensive study. And they put them for sale on eBay. And the independent variable is the hand. Half the time, the cards were held by a black hand, and half the time, the cards were held by a white hand. Identical cards, same value, same rating. When they sold on eBay, when they were held by a white hand, they received more than 20% more money in the eBay auction, with the only variable being the color of the hand. There's a similar study done with auto body parts, where they use pronouns, either female or male pronouns, to describe who was selling the auto parts. I wouldn't put too much stock into the result in terms of the percentage, but they came up with the same percentage. If it was indicated that the auto part was being sold by a man, it sold for 20% more than if it was being sold by a woman. I put stock in the results. The 20%, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock that both studies came up with 20%. Now here's the best study I know of about priming, something you wouldn't even think about. So this is a study done of 1,000 Harvard undergraduates. And during their, I think it was their second week at Harvard, they were sent an email congratulating them on how brilliant they are, welcoming to Harvard, wishing them well. And the emails were divided into threes. So a third thought they were getting, a third got an email from Chen, a third Amy, and a third AC. So the Chen is obviously an Asian prime. Amy is obviously a gender prime. And AC is no identity prime. It's just a set of initials. And then they were told that the person sending the email had the following SAT scores. And then a couple weeks later, they were asked if they remembered the email, the first one they got, and if they remembered what the SAT scores were, the person sending it. And so if they got the Asian prime, they remembered the quant score significantly higher than it actually was, and the verbal score lower. If they got the gender prime, they remembered the quant score significantly lower than it actually was, and the verbal score significantly higher. And if they had the AC, the no prime, they more accurately remembered what the original SAT scores were that they were told the author of the email was that sent the email. So it goes to show you something as subtle as an email address can prime racial stereotypes and affect our recollection of fact. I think this is pretty startling. So priming and ambiguous evidence at trial, I'm going to talk about this. This is a study that my dear friend and colleague at the University of Hawaii Law School, we've co-authored a number of law review articles together. We have several more in the works. And this was an example of priming because they saw 5 photographs and 20 pieces of ambiguous evidence. The independent variable was this set of photographs. Half the people in the study got the white skin, half got photoshopped dark skin, and the results are dramatic. And we'll talk about that towards the end. So I want to talk to you about blind spot biases. These are 2 of the authors of the implicit association test, the inventors of it, Dr. Benazzi and Dr. Greenwald. He's at Washington University in Seattle. It's a great book, talks about a lot of biases besides the blind spot bias. But a blind spot bias was really well defined by Justice Kennedy in 2016, when he said, bias is easy to attribute to others and difficult to discern in oneself. That is the blind spot bias. And I did a follow-up on this because I was really interested in it. So the first study that was actually done about judges was by a guy named Jeff Leklinski at Cornell. And he asked a group of about 170 judges about their ability to avoid racial prejudice in decision-making compared to other judges in the room. They were at an annual conference. And 97% rated themselves in the top half. I'm not real good at math, unless I have a statistical package that I could plug the numbers into and work it, but you know, it doesn't quite add up. So I was asked to write a law review article for Yale a few years back. And I did this just as part of a footnote I wanted to include in the article. So I sent to all federal judges and I asked themselves to rank themselves in the top 25% of their colleagues in their ability to make decisions free from racial and sex biases. For purposes of this slide, I combined the 2, although they were separate questions. My hypothesis was that the higher ranking judges, what are called Article 3 judges who have life tenure, compared to Article 1 judges like bankruptcy judges and magistrate judges, would have a greater blind spot, and the older the judge would have a greater blind spot. And that's what I found out. So 72% of magistrate judges place themselves in the top 25%, but 92% of senior judges, who by definition have to be at least 65 years old, place themselves in the top 25%, and then bankruptcy judges and magistrate judges were lower. I also did something at the last second that was very helpful because it allowed our court to make a major change in how we do business. I asked this of 5,000 probation officers across the country, got a fabulous number responding, very statistically significant, and 96% of the probation officers put themselves in the top 25%. This led us to make major changes in our court about accepting recommendations on sentencing from judges. We decided to get probation officers out of the business of making sentencing recommendations for a bunch of different reasons, but including their high blind spot bias and the fact that we didn't know what any of their unconscious or implicit biases would be. So I want to talk about implicit white favoritism and racial priming and try and put kind of all these together. This is a really great study because it involves subliminal priming. And that priming, well, I'll tell you how it was done. The participants in the study were shown one of these three photographs, but they were shown it for about 2/100ths of a second. And that's called subliminal. So after this flash, if you ask the people in the three different groups what they saw, they could not tell you, but it was imprinted on their subconscious. Then they were asked to look at crime-relevant and crime-irrelevant objects, guns, knives, notepads, coffee mugs, etc. And this is what frame 1 would look like. By frame 41, you can see the image pretty clearly. So I'm going to put up the data and just kind of quickly explain it to you. It's not that complicated. So if you look at the far right on crime-relevant objects, if they were primed with a flashing black face, they could identify the crime-relevant object in 18 frames. But in those groups, in the group, the third that was primed with the flashing white face, it took them 27 frames in order to identify the crime-relevant object. Why? Because the vast majority of Caucasians and African Americans associate crime with African Americans. So even though they were subliminally primed and they didn't even know they were subliminally primed, it dramatically affected the outcome. There's now about a dozen ape studies where they basically do the same thing. They subliminally prime with images of apes or with, they subliminally prime with a black face, a white face, or no crime. And then they show ape images and ask them if they can identify the ape image at what frame, as the frames get increasingly sharper. And you can see it's basically the identical result from the prior study. So I think it's interesting to know, do children have implicit biases? Again, a Dr. Banaji's study. This measured their implicit biases over time. It wasn't longitudinal in the sense that they followed the same 6-year-olds, but they did a large group of 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and adults, and found that they had the same kind of implicit biases. But then they looked at explicit biases, and this is encouraging. Our explicit biases tend to be reduced by age. There's another study done of children. This was fascinating because it established that children that are 3, 4, and 5-year-old develop very strong unconscious biases. They looked at 2 cities, one in China, one in Cameroon, and these students these are very insular cities. So, and these students were at the private schools across all different economic stratas, but they found the same thing. Implicit bias in age group among children and strong negative outgroup. So favorable biases for their in-group, negative biases for their out-group, and they had strong explicit biases. So now I want to take a look into the emerging science, the emerging neuroscience of implicit bias. we're going to talk about three things. I'll try and go through this very quickly. The amygdala, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and what are called telomeres. So the amygdala, these studies involve putting people in MRI machines. And the only difference between an MRI machine and a fMRI machine, the F stands for functional, is that when you're in an MRI machine and it's a functional MRI, you're just asked to perform some tasks. It could be a variety of different kinds of tasks. And functional MRIs are used in all kinds of neuroscience studies. But the particular studies I'm focusing in on involve the amygdala. So this is what the amygdala looks like. It's a group of nuclei, cells that kind of stick together. It's bilateral in our brain, which means there's one in each half of our brain. And the amygdala is what controls our fear. So it's the fear center. So this is what it looks like when the amygdala is activated on an fMRI machine. The amygdala lights up. And so there are now dozens of studies. And what they do is they put people into MRI machines and then they show them faces, pictures of faces. And then they measure their amygdala response. And originally the studies done were with only Caucasians. And they found that the amygdala activates with regard to black faces, but not white faces. And they picked faces that were neither mad, glad, sad, or happy. They were very nondescript. So you weren't reacting to the facial expression, you were reacting to the color of the face that you saw. And then they started doing tests with not only whites, but blacks. And here's what they found. The strength of amygdala activation correlated with IAT scores on race. So what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. Caucasians tend to, on the black-white IAT, about 75% have moderate to strong anti-black bias. Blacks break down quite differently, about a third, a third, a third. A third of pro-white bias, a third of pro-black bias, and a third of no bias. And then they took measures of expressed racial bias, and there was no correlation. Now, with regard to skin tone, which is something I've become increasingly interested in, rather than just black-white, darker skin faces generate more amygdala activity than light skin faces, and I'm not at all surprised about that, but that has significant consequences in the legal system. So very quickly, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's what it looks like. This is what it looks like on an fMRI. What does it do? It is our executive function. So if you go out tonight and go to the grocery store or go anywhere and you pull into a parking lot, for example, and you see two yellow lines, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that tells us that we should park in between those lines, unless of course you're a jerk and you park over half the line and hog two spots. But you can't function in life without your executive functioning in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. If you go out tonight and you want to get some fast food, your DLPFC tells you you don't want to pull into an auto parts store or into a car wash. You want to pull into a fast food place to get food, or a grocery store or a convenience store, etc. So here's the study about a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we're going to have some fun. So I want everybody now, can they be unmuted for a bit? Do we have the function to do that? Unmute everybody? I don't have that function, but maybe somebody does. So here's what I want you to do. Well, I'll do it for you. I want you to name the color of the ink, not the word color. So that's pretty easy because these are all the same: red, yellow, blue, green, brown. And this is easy: blue, brown, red, yellow, green. But now it's going to get a little bit more difficult. And I want you to shout out the color of the word, not what the color of the ink in the word. Okay, so let's try this.
Red, yellow, blue, green, brown.
brown,
Red.
Yeah, it's a little harder. Let's try it again.
blue,
Blue,
brown, red,
green,
yellow.
Green.
Yeah, y'all did pretty good. That's great. So getting back to this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex test, here's what they did. It was done at a major university in the psychology lab, and they brought in students, just said that they're going to be part of an experiment. They brought them in and they took the same test that you just took. It's called the Stroop test. It's still used today in psychology. It's at least probably 40 years old, but a much more extensive Stroop test. And so they got a baseline for everybody. And then they invited them to come back in 10 days and for further testing, but they didn't know what the test would be. So when they came back in 10 days, they all had specific appointments. They came into the lab, into the waiting room, and they sat down just like they did the first time, and nobody was present. They were just waiting for the lab tech to come get them and take them back to the computer to do the Stroop test, except this time, a young, well-dressed Black man opened the door that the individuals had come in to go to the waiting room, sat down as far away from the person as they could, as to not invade their space, smiled and simply said, "Good morning." And as soon as that person sat down, the lab tech came out, brought him back, and gave him the identical Stroop tests. Shockingly, there is a dramatic difference in their Stroop test. Their executive functioning did not work nearly as well as it did the first time. And the only independent variable or change, other than maybe what they had for breakfast, which nobody would think would affect a Stroop test, was the interaction with young, well-dressed African-American male. So I want to talk quickly about telomeres because I think this is fascinating, because I don't think most of us, I mean, I was a civil rights lawyer, so I think I had a pretty good understanding of how discrimination affected my clients, but I never knew anything about telomeres. What are telomeres? Well, they're the end of chromosomes. What do they do? Well, this is the study. What do they do? Well, I'll show you a picture of them again. That's what they look like. And the ends of the chromosomes are like egglets, which are the end of shoelaces. It's what holds the shoelace together. And the telomeres is what holds the DNA together in your chromosomes. And so telomeres have length. And the best way to measure the length is called leukocyte telomere length. It can be done by just pin prick on your finger and taking a drop of blood. And with somewhat sophisticated equipment, you can tell somebody's telomere length. But what's so important about that? Well, here was the hypothesis. Shorter leukocyte telomere length is associated with chronic disease and earlier mortality. You don't live as long if you have shorter leukocyte telomere length. So the hypothesis was that the more frequent reports of racial discrimination and having a greater implicit anti-Black score correlated with shorter LTL in Black males. That's a big mouthful. Here's what they're doing. They decided to screen out Blacks who have, on an IAT score, a strong anti-Black implicit bias. That would be about a third of the Blacks. And my understanding is because that kind of indicates some loathing about members of your own race. And then they wanted to know about reports of racial discrimination. So there's a test for that. It's called experiences of discrimination in 9 different categories. So it looks at housing, all kinds of healthcare, jobs, education, all different aspects of the way, places where people can be discriminated against. And they did very sophisticated multivariate regression analysis. and they found that those reporting higher levels of incidences of race discrimination in their own lives and anti-Black IATs had the shortest telomere length and would likely not live as long as others. That's pretty powerful about the impact. So I want to talk to you about a couple workplace studies about implicit bias, even though some of them weren't actually implicit bias studies. So one of these studies, it's really well known. It's called the Orchestra Study, and it was done in 2005 by some labor economists, and it dealt with blind auditions of female musicians. So here's what they did. They looked at Chicago and Boston and 3 other highly regarded orchestras, and only 12% of the musicians were women in the 1980s. And then they decided that, or the orchestras decided that they should have blind auditions to try and increase the number of women. And traditionally, at an orchestra audition, the person auditioning, and there would be several for, first violinist or in the flute section, whatever, would walk across the stage, sit in a chair, there'd be a microphone, and they would play their instrument in front of the symphony conductor and the head of the orchestra, the president of the orchestra. Well, somebody decided, hey, maybe we ought to do blind auditions. So they set up these auditions now with a big screen. So when the people came in for their audition, the 2 people judging had no idea what their ethnicity was, what their gender was. And lo and behold, it didn't do anything to improve the number of women for the first couple of years. Anybody know why? It's a fascinating backstory. It was because it was traditional for orchestra auditions for the musicians, if they were female, to wear high heels. So that tapping of the high heel across the floor before they got to the chair and sat down to play the instrument, that was priming. And that primed the gender stereotype. Almost always these 2 people making the decisions were male. And so there wasn't an increase in the hiring of female musicians. Somebody then figured it out and said, we need to send a letter to all the musicians who are auditioning and tell them to wear as flat a shoes as possible. That's not a problem for most males because I'm going to engage in stereotyping. I haven't seen many males in my life wear high heels. And anyway, once they went to blind auditions and figured out the priming, it dramatically improved the chances that a woman would be hired. Matter of fact, female musicians grew by 5-fold. Here's another really famous labor study. This one has been replicated dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? Here, what they did is they looked at job openings in, I believe it was Boston and Chicago, want ads in the local newspapers. These were companies that actually had openings and actually used the want ads. There wasn't the internet like back then like there was. And they sent out resumes to these companies for actual job openings. The resumes were identical. The only difference was in the name, in the first name. White sounding names, black sounding names. And what they were measuring was the callback ratio. In other words, when they sent in the resume, did they get a call to come in for an interview? And white sounding names, the ratio was 1.5. So you had a much higher chance of being called back if you had a white sounding name rather than a black sounding name. Here's another one about legal writing skills. So this was a study about implicit bias in the workplace. 22 major national law firms, 60 partners, nice breakdown of the partners. They were told that as part of the study, they were to evaluate a legal memo prepared by Thomas Meyer, who was a third-year associate at a large national law firm and an NYU grad. But in this memo from the third-year associate, they deliberately inserted all kinds of errors, spelling errors, substantive errors, legal errors, fact errors. Here's what they found. And half the people were told that Thomas Meyer was white, and half were told that he was black. When they were told that he was white or primed with just the word, he's white, much more favorable reviews. Look at this one. Can't believe he went to NYU. Good analytical skills, average at best. So you can see dramatic difference. And there was no correlation with the race, ethnicity, sex of the partners. Female partners found more errors and wrote longer narratives. That was interesting. But the overall rating, this is a statistically significant, dramatic difference. So I don't always want to pick on lawyers and judges. Here's a physician study. A very interesting study. It's now been replicated many times. This study used IATs and also explicit measures of bias, and they randomized it. So you either got the general biographical information first or the IAT first. It was a really well put together study. The doctors were then given a clinical vignette. They were told that Mr. Thompson, half were told he was white, half were told he was black, 50 years old, presented with sharp stabbing pains consistent with a heart attack. And then they were given the explicit tests and the IAT tests. And then they were asked, the big question was, would you prescribe clot-busting thrombolytic drugs? And doctors expressed no preference for black and whites on whether or not they would give the drugs, but their IAT scores correlated with giving thrombolytic drugs, so that if you were white, you had a much higher chance of getting the thrombolytic drug than if you were black. It's pretty stark and startling, but like I said, it's been replicated. One more study about lawyers. This was done by Professor Jerry Kong. It looks like Kane, but it's pronounced Kong at UCLA. And his study was about ideal litigators, white, question mark, measuring the myth of colorblindness. So what he did was, I'm just gonna put this up and kind of explain it to you pretty quickly. So that's okay. I'll explain it to you. The participants listened to and saw two different videotape depositions. And the videotape deposition was focused on the person deposing. You couldn't see the lawyer, excuse me, asking questions. And before each deposition, they were shown for 5 seconds a picture of the litigator and the name. And so half of them got, the William Cole, half the Sung Chang. And that was just for 5 seconds. They listened to these depositions, and then they were asked to evaluate the lawyer asking the questions in the depositions and whether they would recommend that male lawyer, Asian or Caucasian, to friends and family. Dramatic difference, dramatic difference. Strong preference over the white litigator over the Asian, even though the questions were being asked by the same lawyer. So there are only a couple of judges' studies on implicit bias, and one of them is one that I was a co-author in. But we're just going to do the one quick jury study, and this is the one that I talked about. Justin Levinson and Danielle Young. Justin is a law professor at the University of Hawaii, a co-author of mine, and Danielle Young is she was a PhD student at the time. She's now a full professor at the East Coast University, teaching in cognitive psychology. So in this study, this was the independent variable. Half saw for just a few seconds the black skin, half saw the white skin. They all got all of the information was the rest for both groups. And so they viewed 5 crime scene photos of an armed robbery at a quick stop mini mart. Only difference was the one photograph that I showed you. They were then given 20 pieces of ambiguous evidence. I'll give you an example of the ambiguous evidence. The actual photos that they were shown had a timestamp at the bottom, so you knew when the photograph was taken of this robber of the mini mart. And then they were told that the person that was arrested later that evening had a movie stub in their pocket, and the movie was 7 miles away. This was in Honolulu, and if you know anything about traffic in Honolulu, you don't get very far when something's 7 miles away, regardless of the time of day. And so when they were primed with the white skin, the jurors said, well, gee, that's an alibi. He could be in two places at the same time. He's obviously not guilty. When they were primed with the black skin, the consensus was, you know, he must have bought that movie ticket, put it in his pocket, never went to the movie, so that he would kind of have an alibi if he ever got caught. They were also told that the person on trial was right-handed. Notice that the person in the picture is carrying a firearm in their left hand. When they were primed with the white skin, he couldn't have committed the crime. He's right-handed. When they were primed with the black skin, oh, he switched hands. He was clearly right-handed, but decided to hold the weapon in his left hand. And that way it would create a potential defense at trial. So dramatically different views in how they interpreted the evidence, and dramatically different views in whether they thought the defendant was guilty. And Justin and Danielle did something very interesting. They measured how guilty they thought the person was, and they thought the black individual was very, very guilty. The few people who found the white individual guilty thought, well, guilty, but not by much. So 2 judge studies very quickly. The first one was done by Jeffrey Klinsky and his team. And it was published over a decade ago at Notre Dame. The study was actually done in 2008. And they asked a bunch of trial court judges from around the country. They did IAT testing, and they showed, this was interesting, the judges, strong white preference among white judges, mixed preference among black judges. So here's the interesting thing. The white preference among white judges was stronger than whites on the black-white IAT, the millions of people who have taken on the internet. So judges have stronger in-group favoritism and preferences than people who aren't judges who take the test on the internet. And that's what we found in our study as well, too. And so black judges, comparable IAT scores as blacks. White judges, statistically stronger white preference than whites on the internet. And they gave longer, the white judges gave longer sentences to juvenile offenders who were of color, using multivariate regression analysis to rule out prior criminal records and other factors. So this is a study that Justin Levinson and I and our statistician, Kiyoshi Hayoki, who teaches graduate level statistics classes in Japan and is a good friend of Justin's. We did this study of federal judges, and it was a complicated study. We decided to use Asian and Jewish for our variables, because they really hadn't been studied hardly at all in terms of implicit biases, and not at all with regard to the length of sentences. So they're often considered privileged minorities. It was a complicated study. I won't go into all the details, but I'll just give you our results. And we had federal judges from all over the country and state court trial judges from 8 states. The states were selected totally at random. And then I got permission for the state Supreme Court justices to test their judges. So here are the results. Federal and state court judges, strong to moderate implicit biases against Asians, relative to Caucasians. Asians were associated with negative moral stereotypes, greedy, dishonest, scheming. I was actually shocked by this. Caucasians were associated with positive moral stereotypes. That didn't shock me at all. And the same thing, you take out the word Asians, you put in Jews, identical findings. So a lot of implicit biases against both Asians and Jews. Give longer sentences to Jewish versus Christian defendants. Male judges showed stronger anti-Jewish implicit biases than female judges. This was the good news, if there was any in our study. The political party of the president who appointed the judges did not predict IET scores. And that's been true of several studies I've done. The political party of the judges, almost always 96% of judges are members of the same political party as the president that nominates them. Protestant Catholic judges had higher pro-Christian, anti-Jewish IET biases compared to judges who reported no religion. Judges' self-reported agreement with Asian stereotypes were correlated with their agreement on Jewish stereotypes. Anti-Jewish pro-Christian implicit biases predicted the sentencing length of Christian defendants. The higher the bias, the shorter the sentence. That's disturbing. So I want to talk a little bit about my current area of interest, which I just think is super fascinating, and it's Afrocentric facial feature bias. I'll just cover it very quickly. This is what I mean by Afrocentric facial feature bias. Cognitive sociologists and psychologists have come up with 9 variables to measure Afrocentricity. The gentleman on the right is very high in Afrocentric facial features, very dark skin, wider lips and nose, and they're kind of the predominant features compared to the gentleman on the left. He would be, in my view, moderate in terms of Afrocentricity. So it's not a term of art, but it refers to a combination. These are the major features that I just mentioned. There are some others, but doing regression analysis, they're not very significant to judge it. So the first study was done by Jennifer Eberhardt at your Stanford University. And here's what she found. She looked at 600 federal death penalty cases in Philadelphia with Black defendants and white victims. And the solid black line is strong Afrocentric facial features of the defendant. The hash line is very light Afrocentric facial features. The bottom line was defendants with strong Afrocentric facial features, looking at ruling out all other factors using sophisticated regression analysis, were twice as likely to get the death penalty. I've written about this both in Yale and with another my co-professor, Victoria Plout, cognitive psychologist and law professor at UC Berkeley, rewrote about this presumption of dangerousness based on skin tone. I'm going to jump ahead a whole lot about that because I want to get into debiasing before I leave you. So here's the deal on debiasing. I just downloaded a study today. Well, it's kind of a paper. You know, they never call them black papers, they're always white papers. That's kind of interesting. And it's called The Evolving Science of Implicit Bias, an updated resource for state court community. And it's done by the National Center for State Courts, which usually does some pretty good work. You know, they claim there are debiasing techniques that work. That's not true. That's the bad news. There is no magic bullet for debiasing implicit biases. There are some things that you can do to reduce the likely chances that implicit bias will affect your decision-making, but there's no empirical evidence to prove that it actually really works in real-world decision-making. But here's what I've come up with, and here's what I preach to judges and lawyers. Learn and examine your own stereotypes and how they trigger and prime your unconscious biases. Well, you need to do that by taking the IAT and find out what your unconscious biases are And then you need to start thinking about your own stereotypes, your own stereotypes. My stereotypes when I was a judge early on before I got involved in this was if I had a young Black male defendant with strong Afrocentric facial features, in my brain, a light bulb went off. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. That's not necessarily true, but that was my implicit bias speaking to me. So what else can you do? Slow down. Be mindful of your own decision-making process. So for example, I had a very high criminal caseload. You wouldn't think the Northern District of Iowa would have many criminal cases. We had more criminal cases than the Northern District of California, the District of Minnesota, the Northern District of Illinois and Chicago, the Southern District of New York, and the district in Washington, D.C. combined. Very heavy criminal caseload. So I'd be banging out sentences left and right. I had to force myself to slow down. And I would make a decision of what the range I thought would be based on everything in the pre-sentence report. I had the racially identifying information taken out of the pre-sentence report, so I didn't know it. It had to be put back in after my sentencing when it got sent off to Washington, D.C. And then when I went out and had the actual sentencing, I would usually see the defendant for the first time because most defendants plead guilty. Our magistrate judges took the guilty pleas. So it'd be the first time I'd see a defendant. If they happened to be in trial, it would have been usually 120 days earlier. And I had so many trials, I wouldn't have remembered them anyway. But so I had all the racial identifying information taken out. And I just looked at the sentencing information, the briefs filed by the parties, the pre-sentence report, and I put down a range of what I thought the sentence should be. When I went out of the courtroom, and it was a young male, African American with strong Afrocentric facial features, that would trigger this dangerousness in my brain. And I would force myself to stop the sentencing and make myself write down, okay, what are the objective factors that indicate I should go higher that I wasn't aware of before I came out to sentence the defendant? And 99 times out of 100, there was nothing. So I knew it was my implicit bias speaking to me. Occasionally, the government would raise an argument that I maybe hadn't given enough weight to, and that might change my mind to go higher, but that was an objective reason that I could literally write down. Slow down, focus on objective factors. Determine the objective basis for your decision before announcing it, and give yourself time to self-critical review of possible bias creep. When you make a decision, if you have the ability to slow down just a little bit, ask yourself, even though I'm relying on objective factors, or what I think are objective factors, what's the possibility that my implicit biases are affecting my judgment? Very important thing to do when you're making decisions. Know yourself. If you're a person of white privilege like I am, and a tendency towards in-group favoritism, which I still have, check that. When you're relying on subjective factors, which most of us make decisions based on subjective factors, make sure they're not based on generalizations, gut feelings, biases, or stereotypes. Here's the most important thing that I can leave you with. Be skeptical rather than impressed with your own objectivity. You all think you're objective. I get that. We like to cast ourselves in a favorable light, often more favorable than we really are. So you should be skeptical of your objectivity, not impressed by it. And that will help you make decisions that hopefully will be less tied to implicit biases that you have. Hey, questions? Anybody?
I just want to say thank you really quickly, Judge Bennett, before committee members hopefully jump in with questions. And I wholeheartedly agree. That's a great note to end on. Remain skeptical of oneself.
Yeah, it's hard to do because we're all overly impressed with our abilities, me included. But I've learned to back way off from that. So I'd be happy to take any questions about anything and try and answer them to the best of my ability. Don't be shy. Particularly like to hear from the non-lawyers in the group. But judges, lawyers too.
So I have to thank. Oh, who? This is Kareem. But if somebody was going to go, I'll take a next turn.
I have a comment / question or clarification, I guess. No, thank you so much, Judge Bennett. That was amazing. I love your examples. I say as the chair of diversity for all new attorneys for the California Lawyers Association, and I always love the different examples, different ways.
Thank you.
To add on to you, I guess I'm always pessimistic with these implicit bias. Not to say anything wrong with yours. There's nothing wrong. It's always the outcome. There's nothing you can really do. But you say otherwise, or kind of. Just check yourself. Right. It's essentially check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's the common saying.
Wow, I love that line. I'm gonna plagiarize it from you.
No worries. Again, I I try my best with the chair of diversity stuff. Another thing you can do is just like what you're doing is sharing it with others. That's something. Another one is actually implementing actual rules and regulations, which you're all doing as well. But it's more of explicit thing, which we as the community bar examiners will be doing in terms of the bar exam. And one self-promotion, I guess, is I also wrote an article similar to this on the future of legal AIs for the ABA litigation section that talks about biases in the programmer's level of AIs, or how that could be implemented with the legal technology. And one of my favorite things is the application biases, which is something that not many people discuss about. In law, this is important because it's what rules are being applied into what, which you did address, but it's how I coin as application biases. You can have a 100% foolproof drug test. It detects drugs at any call stops and whatnot. But if it's only being applied to a certain demographic, then you have an application bias, and then that construes messes up the actual results of research and historical data biases and whatnot. Well, I think you did an overall amazing job, and I like to say to add more to them, there's nothing you can do.
Well, I've been thinking this week about, could I come up with anything for bar examiners? And I couldn't, but I just thought of something based on the comments you made. So thank you very much. So I'll just digress very briefly. When I became chief judge of our district, at the courthouse that I worked in, we had the portraits of the 16 federal judges going back to the 1860s that preceded me, and they were all white males. I never had my portrait taken at that point. I waited till I retired. But the day I became chief judge, I went down and I took those portraits of the 16 white male judges, and I put them up on a secure floor for the judges to admire themselves and their predecessors, because I didn't want jurors, when they walked into the courthouse, to look at all white male judges. And then I went a step further. We went out and hired a world-class photographer, Julia Moose from Birmingham, Alabama. She is world-class, to take photographs of new citizens at our immigration ceremonies. And we had those photographs in the jury assembly room. So the first photographs that jurors see in my district, 55% of the defendants I tried were persons of color. I had 4 jurors of color in over 300 criminal trials spanning 24 years. Jurors were almost all Caucasian. So it was important for these Caucasian jurors when they go in the jury assembly room to see these incredible portraits of new citizens from countries all over the world, every shade of color imaginable. And then we had a little plaque describing who they were. So I don't know how the bar exam, I know it's done online during COVID, but you know, when it's proctored and people are passing out the exam, it would be very important to have persons of color be represented in those proctors, because that psychological impact of seeing somebody that looks like me in a position of authority, passing out the bar exam or timing them or whatever their duties are, cognitive psychologists will tell you can have a very positive influence on their performance. So that's one thing simple you can do. And when you do it online, if you have people introducing the procedures, have persons of color do that as well. So that's just one very teeny step that you could take.
And to just quickly add on to that, I'm an individual with a disability, and I usually help check in on the disability testing competition sites nearby. And that's something in which I always advocate is we need more representation, especially in the legal field.
Absolutely, that is so true. Thank you. Anybody else? David, do I have time for one more question?
Leah had her hand raised. We could do Leah and then maybe Kareem.
Hi, I don't actually have a question. I have a comment, which is just to thank you for your vulnerability, I would say. I think you were very direct about, your understanding of your own biases. And I think that's a great model for all of us as we try to engage in this work, is just being really candid about how this impacts every single one of us. And I know as a person of color, I too have my own biases, and it's important that we acknowledge that as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And when I took those early 3 implicit association tests, I couldn't believe it. That couldn't be me. I was shocked by it. I couldn't believe it. And when I finally realized, not too much longer after I read the articles, it rocked my core values and my core perceptions about myself. And that was really important, because that enabled me then to get beyond that and to become a better judge and a better person. So, I used to fight being vulnerable when I was young, and now I embrace it as much as I can. I wish I had this wisdom when I was in my 20s and 30s. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor, and I hope you'll think about some of the things that I've talked about. And David, why don't you share my email address? So if anybody has a question that they want to ask me that they didn't want to ask in front of a group, I'll do my best. I get about 75 emails a day, but I do my best to answer every one of them. It might take me 48 hours, but I'm pretty prompt. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, because I just kind of want to spread the word. And congratulations for taking on this subject. It's not an easy topic. So.
Well, we, again, really appreciate it, Judge Bennett. I wonder if you could take one more from Kareem.
Sure. Oh, I'll be happy to.
And I know that you're a fan of answering questions.
I am.
Thank you, Judge Bennett, for taking the time and for providing us that insight and background. I'm really interested in this ideology from an institutional standpoint. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the discussion that's happened over the past couple of years with a lot of the social justice movements has been about anti-racism work. And so when I approach the work that we do here, and I serve on other committees, I'm always looking at how our systems inherently itself, just on its own merit, its own standing, has implicit bias embedded within, and how the system was kind of designed to work that way. And so what I've kind of was processing as you were providing a lot of the examples was regarding about how you had the different types of polarized images, right? That were kind of playing on those type of biases. And so I try to bring it back to the role that we have here. And I'm wondering, what is your recommendation for someone like me who's a public member to understand that there are systems that are designed, but then there's a way to work within it. But then how do you appeal to that system to not work business as usual, and also understand that there's another element that we have to kind of disrupt to get to a place of equity and ensuring that everybody has a fair shot at the table?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, complex question. You know, it's kind of like the vaccine deniers, the people who denied that there's such a thing as structural or institutional racism. I mean, what planet are they living on? Our criminal justice system and our civil justice system, for that matter, is full of examples of structural racism. And so part of the process is education. You know, this thing about Afrocentric facial features that I've been interested in, I've got pending a $1 million National Science Foundation grant to study Afrocentric facial feature bias. It's been studied only in 5 studies on the criminal side and only with regard to sentencing. I want to study it with regard to jury selection, view of evidence, a number of how judges view elocution. On the civil side, does it affect the award of damages? Does it affect jurors' believability about lay witnesses, about expert witnesses? And so there's a lot of ways to study this. And so I think education to prove to the doubters that our system is filled with structural racism, structural discrimination against people with disabilities, structural gender discrimination. Now that's changing a bit. I just read this morning that 37% of state Supreme Court justices and Court of Appeals judges in the state systems are women. So that's great. But you know, 55% of the law students are women. So, you know, look at the partners in law firms. So, you know, I think just more needs to be done to educate people about structural racism. And there's a lot of people that are a heck of a lot smarter than I am working on techniques to try and reduce structural racism in our system, but it becomes so systemic that you run into all kinds of barriers to try and change it. And so, you know, we've got a huge problem in Iowa with, we're the second worst state in the country with, we have the highest percentage of African Americans in our state prisons compared to our population of any state in the country. I mean, it's shocking. And so that's a result of everything from racial profiling and who gets stopped, who gets charged, how they get charged. So there are a lot of people working on it. And I've got a symposium later this year in my Justice Reform and Innovation class, where I've got the police department coming in and a community action group that did an actual empirical study about who gets stopped. And we're going to talk about institutional racism, which the police department claims there isn't any, but the study proves otherwise. So I think it's just education and being relentless and being gritty and not giving up. But I think education and, you know, it's, I used to say it was hard to argue with science, but with the anti-vaxxers, it doesn't seem to be hard to argue with science. So I think we can bring science into it, come up with really good empirical evidence, make our case and try and move people along. You know, Martin Luther King said, he had a lot of great quotes, but the one I love is, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I've had that on my email address and on my judicial stationery when I was a judge, and on my academic stationery and on my mediation and arbitration stationery. I have that quote: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But then I've added, "but it doesn't bend on its own." So each of you, and each of the people you work with, you have the opportunity to place your hand on the moral arc of justice. And we need to all work really hard to bend it towards justice. I wish I had more specific solutions. But thank you so much, Judge.
That's a
Thank you,
hopeful and
Judge.
pragmatic. Oh, go ahead, Kareem.
Oh, no, I was to say thank you, Judge. I appreciate your response.
Thank you. All
Thank
my
you.
best to everybody.
Excellent. Thank you again, Judge Bennett. And I will turn it back over to our chairperson, Esther, or perhaps Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Bennett. And thank you, everyone, for being at this meeting. Meeting business has concluded now that the presentation is over. So if no one else has any other business that they'd like to discuss, the meeting is adjourned. Okay, meeting is officially adjourned, and see you guys all in October.
See you then.
Thanks, Esther.
Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Here.
Bye.